Today in our teaching in-service that we do in studio each week, an interesting conversation came up, so I wanted to share it with you guys. We have about 10 of us that work at the studio, that we all are teaching, and sometimes we share each other's clients. So say if somebody goes on holidays or if somebody can't work their shift, then one of us might fill in for somebody else. And one of our relatively newer teachers asked the question, say if she's filling in for another instructor, and she notices that a client is, for example, doing footwork on the reformer and they're imprinting their spine, so they're not maintaining neutral spine, neutral pelvis, which is the ideal. Does she try and correct that? And if not, why not? And I think that there's a few things that we need to consider when we're working with somebody else's client. So when we talk about neutral pelvis and neutral spine, it's something that we all learn when we're learning all about Pilates. And it's definitely a foundation of an understanding of good movement in the Pilates studio. There's no doubt about it. But we don't live in neutral pelvis, neutral spine. It is literally a foundation of movement. So while I do want my clients to understand it well, if I'm working with somebody else's client, I'm not familiar with that person's body. So I don't know where they're coming from. So I don't know what their body position was when they started their Pilates. So potentially, if I'm working with them and they're imprinting their spine into the bed, that may be an improvement from where they have come, from when they started. Also, some people are not necessarily comfortable in an anatomical neutral pelvis, neutral spine, and there may be a good reason that their regular instructor has allowed them to maintain an imprint. I know that this is controversial, and I know that a lot of teachers are gonna be like, no, you have to teach neutral pelvis, neutral spine. Now, absolutely, getting to that point of somebody being able to move and exercise, for example, in footwork, which traditionally and when taught to an ideal body is in neutral pelvis, neutral spine, if that position is causing the client discomfort, pain, or exacerbating an injury or pain that they have in an injury when they're doing it, then we need to decide as the teacher, what is the goal? Well, ultimately, the goal is right now for the person to be able to perform their exercises free of pain. That's goal number one, always. When I'm working with a client, because I work with, or in the studio, we work with complex conditions. So this is in a semi-private situation. And like I said, I don't know where that person has come from. So the bottom line is, if I'm working with a client that I'm not familiar with, I'm just filling in with the instructor for one or two sessions, and I see that the person is not necessarily in their neutral body position, say in the footwork, I definitely would ask them, has such and such, whoever it is that normally teaches them, has neutral pelvis, neutral spine been discussed with you? Yes or no? If it hasn't, then for sure I'm going to touch on it. But if it has, and that client tells me, yeah, we talk about it, I've tried it, but it hurts my back, then I'm not going to start changing that body position there and then, because I'm only filling in for one or two sessions, right? And invariably, my goal, if I'm working with somebody that I'm not that familiar with and I'm only there for the one session to fill in, is to keep them moving and keep them just coming to the studio while that regular teacher isn't there. I definitely would then have a discussion with their regular teacher and ask them, how come that person imprints their spine when they're doing their footwork, say? And most of the time, that instructor would have a good reason for that to be happening. If they don't have a good reason, then that discussion definitely needs to be had, right? But what I'm saying is I'm not going to pop into somebody's session and start changing body shapes, because when we really start to change body shapes and try and do that in one session, it can actually have a knock-off effect on other parts of the body. So it could force their QL, like their back muscles, to be activating too much. It could force their hip flexors to be working too much. And most of the time, a good instructor has a plan for that person. So let's not get too fixated on a client that we hardly know having to work on that neutral body position if we really don't know the body. And say if it's somebody who has a sit-down desk job and they spend a lot of time in that position where they potentially have a rounded back, poor posture anyway, shortened hip flexors, shortened hamstrings, tight thoracic, tight neck and shoulders, then by forcing their body position, it potentially isn't going to be doing them any favors. What will happen if that person continues to come to Pilates over a long period of time regularly, which is how Pilates is best served to anybody, the body will naturally start to change shape ever so slightly in a way that the body can sustain that and in a way that it feels good for the body. So you just don't want to be forcing anything in somebody's body when you don't know it. What does happen, and what I often hear, is say if somebody fills in for me, if I'm not there, and for example, it is somebody who I know that they're not maintaining their neutral spine, but I can see that their body position is improving as we go down the track over the months or over the period that they've been with me. So I allow for them to find their own corrections in a way that feels good. If somebody steps into working with that client and they force them into having a space between their back and the reformer when they're laying down, quite often I'll come back from my holiday and my client will complain to me that they had that one session with that teacher who doesn't know them and they ended up with a sore back. So food for thought for all of us, that what we look on paper when we're doing our teacher training, like the ideal body position, doesn't exist in nature, in anybody, and it most certainly does not exist in the studio, because people are coming to us because they have poor posture or compensatory patterns, and we've got to be very, very careful how we're trying to correct those things. And instead of trying to overcorrect somebody so that they look like they're on paper, rather encourage them to perform movements that might open them up a little bit or might lift them out of themselves, maybe in a seated position or in a standing position, rather than harp on them all the time about correct body position in everything that they do. Just food for thought. I hope that this helps, and sing out with any other discussions that you'd like to have on anything to do with movement. Okay, have a good night. See you soon.